Good afternoon. Welcome to our 2021 Senior Thesis presentations. Thank you for making time to be here in person, or if you're checking us out online, thank you for taking the time to log in to see these presentations. And before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the person that has kind of taken this project over the last year and a half. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge Mr. Hortman and his leadership. Working closely with Mr. Hortman, he took something that was already a really good project and made it even that much better. So thank you for your leadership, Mr. Hortman. So yeah, about 8 or 9 months ago, beginning of the school year, we asked the seniors, pick a topic. Pick something that's meaningful, that's important, potentially controversial, something that matters in our community, something that matters maybe to our global community. So they picked a topic, researched some history, some current events. They researched the biblical worldview, they interviewed experts, and they took all that research, about 1 semester's worth of research, formed a thesis statement based off of what they all researched, and then set forth in writing a 10 to 15 page paper, which that was the 3rd quarter. And what we're experiencing here today, in a sense, is a culmination of that, months long research. And it's, a 10 to 15 minute presentation followed by about a 10 to 15 minute question and answer session. So what we're all seeing here today is just a small sliver of the amount of work that they put into this. And the seniors have all worked very hard this year to put this on for you guys. So can we give the seniors a round of applause? It's been hard on them. The itis has set in. Meanwhile, we're asking them to keep working hard, and they have. Before we begin, I'd like to offer us a prayer for this event and for our students. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this community, for this school, and for these students. We thank you for your presence here today. I pray especially today for Lorelei, for Michaela, and for Yamil. I pray that your presence would calm them, give them wisdom and purpose as they come up here today to make us more wise. And I pray that as an audience, our hearts and our minds would be open to what they're sharing. And may we leave here wiser than when we came in. We pray in Jesus' name, amen. All right, without any further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage Lorelei Breeden.
What do you think of philosophy? Perhaps you admire undergraduate students who major in the subject and are either deciding to do the same or are wishing you did. But more than likely, your initial thought is, why would someone major in philosophy? What in the world will they do with their undergraduate degree apart from teach philosophy? That was my first thought too. Philosophers get the reputation of being like Socrates, wandering around the city of Athens barefoot, bothering all of the innocent passersby with their incessant questions about the good life. Okay, that may not be exactly what you think of when you think of philosophy, but you get the idea. Philosophy isn't usually seen as a worthwhile pursuit in our modern career-oriented society. I believed this misconception to be entirely true until I took the time to look into the subject myself. After joining a philosophy discussion group that specializes in ancient Greek philosophy, my opinion on the matter changed entirely as I confronted what I believed to be the most important questions I will have to ponder during my life. In dwelling on these life-altering questions through ancient Greek philosophy, I discovered that I had missed this opportunity to practice introspection, to examine and better my character, and to develop a love of learning that would pervade the rest of my life in my formal education. Now, something to keep in mind is that all educators, no matter their preference for either classical or modern education, can probably agree that the purpose of education is to prepare children for adulthood. Where they disagree is what aspects of adulthood children should be prepared for. Those who value modern education will typically argue that youth should be educated in a manner that will result in strong standardized test scores, which are meant to indicate students' scholastic capabilities. Those who value classical education, however, attempt to prepare students for life. This means that they work to cultivate students' characters, critical thinking skills, and their desires for knowledge. Today, I will be demonstrating exactly how the classical model of education supports the claim that all students in secondary and higher education should be provided with an intentional instruction in ancient Greek philosophy for three critical reasons: the current lack of excellence of character, the modern need for introspection, and the timeless importance of continuous learning. Let me start by describing what I mean by the words excellence of character. In one of Plato's dialogues called the Meno, Socrates converses with a young man who belongs to a wealthy aristocratic family. It becomes apparent that this young man, named Meno, is accustomed to having answers for any question he's faced with, no matter the topic of conversation. Meno's replies are always met with more questions, though, by Socrates, who makes it apparent that Meno's answers are insufficient. Meno's three suggestions for what constitutes virtue are: the virtue of a man is to manage his public affairs. The ability to rule over people is the virtue common to all. And virtue is to desire beautiful things and have the power to acquire them. Not only are students able to analyze these arguments and come up with refutations on their own through classical education, they're led through the process of doing so by Plato, who engages his readers through the use of the Socratic method in his dialogues. Upon hearing this, you may be wondering how this will encourage students to develop their own characters for the better. Well, it's the belief of many philosophers that the simple act of studying philosophy will result in a better, reformed, and generally excellent character within the student. We're often told that what we listen to, watch, or read will impact how we act or what we think, right? Well, if you're constantly reading or hearing about the many ways in which one can explore virtue and develop it themselves, this will start to impact your personal beliefs and actions. Furthermore, a former professor from Vassar College named Brian Van Noorden states that historically, the study of philosophy has been intended to make one a better person. In Plato's dialogues, Socrates is presented as asking questions such as, what is courage? What is justice? Because knowing the answer will make us better people. Noorden claims that this is not only the accepted belief in Western philosophy, it's also the common conception in Eastern philosophy as well. Given this, one can conclude that centuries of tradition within general philosophical studies, which includes both Western and Eastern ideas and philosophers, have proven that there is immense value in having students study philosophy for the purpose of bettering their characters. Now, in contrast to these centuries of tradition, many would agree that the youth of present America are bombarded by both technology and mass media. Modern technologies are used as tools to take individuals away from time spent in tedium when they could otherwise be using that time to think and introspect, which can just be thought of as the ability to examine one's thoughts or feelings. Now that most modern individuals are able to carry a device everywhere with them, they have no reason to spend time alone, thinking about important issues like who they are, why they exist, what purpose their lives have, what constitutes a good life. The use of technology has grown so significantly and rapidly that scientists, educators, and regular citizens alike worry that citizens are losing their ability to focus on individual tasks, and arguably more importantly, the ability to introspect. Teddy Wayne, an American novelist and short story writer, gives a personal account of this happening when he writes, "There are many moments throughout my average day that, lacking print reading material in a previous era, were once occupied by thinking or observing my surroundings, walking or waiting somewhere, riding the subway, lying in bed unable to sleep, or before mustering the energy to get up. Now, though, I often find myself in these moments picking up my phone to check a notification, to browse and read the internet, to text, use an app, or listen to audio." Wayne mentions a study done in 2015 that analyzed how dependent upon their devices individuals between the ages of 18 and 33 were, and how this dependency may impact their reflective capabilities. These studies simply gathered data on how often participants use their smartphones throughout the day by way of an app. The participants were then asked to reflect and determine how many times they use their devices. The findings were that participants estimated an average of 37 uses throughout the day, when the actual number was around 85. Wayne states that checking the phone is a compulsive behavior that few people even realize they're doing. So not only does constantly having a device with us impact how we're able to think and introspect, we also have a complete lack of knowledge of how often we use them. It thus follows that introspection must have a place in education. Society is being driven away from reflection, and the only way to combat this is to teach youth to set aside their devices and their modern distractions and make time for introspection. This is where the ancient Greek philosophers factor in. Plato recognizes how important it is to understand oneself before pursuing obscure topics. He expertly leads his readers to begin this line of thinking in his works. For example, Plato describes Socrates in the Phaedrus as being unwilling to pursue an obscure topic like mythology when he doesn't yet know himself. Socrates says, "I am still unable, as the Delphic inscription orders, to know myself. And it really seems to me ridiculous to look into other things before I have understood that." Despite Socrates admitting to not understanding himself, he then gives examples of questions that he has directed at his own character, such as, "Am I a beast more complicated and savage than Typhon? Or am I a simple, gentler creature with a share in the divine and gentle nature?" The idea of knowing thyself is interspersed throughout Greek history and philosophy, making it clear that Greek educators thought that students should be asking themselves similar questions to the ones Socrates posed in an attempt to better understand their own characters and tendencies. Of course, it's not enough to simply teach students what constitutes an excellent character or to only assist them in learning how to be introspective and disregard modern distractions. What educators must understand is that they're called to instill a desire within their students to continue doing this, even after they've completed their class or have moved on from their secondary or higher education altogether. Plato comments on this very thing in the Republic. Through the use of the character Socrates, he expresses the belief that it's not just the youth of Athens who should be educated. He claims that adults must continue learning all throughout their lives as well, and that both men and women should take part in this practice. Not only is this a surprisingly progressive idea, given the patriarchal society he lives in, it's also revealing of Plato's own belief that individuals should continue learning beyond what would now be called formal education. Plato furthers this argument in Book 7 of the Republic by using an allegory, or a story, called The Allegory of the Cave. A research professor from the University of California summarizes it as, Plato depicts people living in a cave, which represents the world of sense experience. In the cave, people see only unreal objects, shadows or images. By connecting this allegory to modern education, one can see that while students are being taught in a test-oriented and career-focused manner, the main goal of education, being the fostering and furthering of students' reasoning, is lost. However, Plato offers an alternative in which the people in the cave are able to abandon their false interpretations of the world and see it realistically. Stroll states, through a painful intellectual process which involves the rejection and overcoming of the familiar, sensible world, they begin an ascent out of the cave into reality. That process is the analog of the exercise of reason, which allows one to apprehend unchanging objects and thus to acquire knowledge. But you may be asking yourself, why do we need ancient Greek philosophy? I'm sure that many of us would agree that modern education is lacking a focus on introspection, excellence of character, and continuous learning. But that's why we have Logos' students read the Bible, right? And I would agree that the Bible not only encourages Christians to focus on these three things, it provides the necessary instructions for us to do so. But would you say that the Bible is the only material that Christians should be reading? Is it the only book that we can read to learn about introspection, excellence of character, and continuous learning? Frederick Douglass, an African-American anti-slavery author who made an unforgettable contribution to the abolishment of slavery, certainly did not think that the Bible is the only book that Christians can be learning these three things from. Throughout his life, he read many classic pieces of literature, and he also read several ancient Greek writers, such as Cicero and Homer. He took it upon himself to get a classical education. He valued the ancient Greeks' teachings and was also incredibly strong in his Christian faith. Ancient Greek philosophy does not take away from anything the Bible teaches. In fact, it strengthens the Bible's teachings and is complementary to the Christian faith. Given this, students should recognize the pitfalls in modern education by studying the ancient Greek philosophers, such as Plato and Socrates. By doing this, they will have the ability to cultivate reasoning, which they can then use to, as the metaphor states, exit the cave and see the surrounding world realistically. If educators wish to instill this desire in their students, there's no better way to do it than to have their students study ancient Greek philosophy. It provides students with the means to discern their souls and practice introspection. With introspection and the exploration of ancient Greek texts comes virtue. As students are studying these ancient Greek texts and studying excellence of character within them. In this continuous endeavor of learning and bettering their own characters, they're naturally led on the path of lifelong learning. As evidenced by the modern lack of excellence of character, the lack of introspection, and the lack of continuous learning, all students in secondary and higher education should be provided with an intentional instruction in ancient Greek philosophy. Such a background would not only forestall the rapid decline of American society and education, it would naturally improve both. And numerous classical educators can be called upon as witnesses in support of this claim. Thank you.
Great job, Lorelei. Thank you. We're now going to move into our section of Q&A, starting with Mr. Hornbaker.
Lorelei, thank you very much for your presentation. One specific question as follow-up. You mentioned near the end that Greek philosophy is a complement to the Bible's teaching. And obviously, when we're talking about the Bible or any other voluminous text, there's many specific teachings included. I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit on the warning that the Bible also gives us that knowledge puffs up, and how that fits within the pursuit of knowledge about ancient Greek philosophy.
Sure. So it's a personal belief that I have that you can use ancient Greek philosophy to pursue anything else. It's not just, focusing on, the pagan gods. It's also using what you're given in ancient Greek philosophy and applying that to other aspects of life. I think that's the purpose of Plato's texts, for example. So you're able to take the lessons from, these dialogues and go and compare them with the Bible and see where they intersect, and maybe even come. Essentially, I am trying to say that you should be reading the Bible and comparing it with other texts. And so ancient Greek philosophy is one of those other texts that I think we should be using, because it provides students with another lens that you can see the Bible through.
Or just a really brief follow-up to that. So one response might be that ancient Greek philosophy is about the accumulation of a certain amount of knowledge that would lead to a particular way of life. Does philosophy itself protect us from knowledge becoming an end in itself without being applied to the lived life?
So, of course, no, it doesn't. The just idea of philosophy isn't going to protect you from wanting to pursue knowledge above all else. But, focusing on excellence of character, focusing on virtue, if you are trying to develop that yourself, I think that's going to naturally lead to you using knowledge in the correct manner, not just focusing on knowledge for its own sake, using it and applying it to other aspects of life, like, pursuing Christianity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lorelei. How might an individual that is already weighted down by all the devices that we have, how might they go about, being more reflective? How could they do that?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in my speech, I think educators should be trying to, even if it comes down to, assigning a time where students need to just stop, interacting with devices, and they just need to sit outside and write something. I had an assignment one time where we were supposed to take an hour of time and sit and reflect and write in a journal. And so it's not just up to the educators, of course. The students have to see that it's important, and they have to want to do that for themselves. But I think if students have that drive, and if educators want to instill this desire in their students, it would be a great start, just scheduling a specific time to practice introspection.
Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if you could elaborate on a point that you made in your speech. Toward the beginning, you mentioned refuted. I wondered if you could elaborate on, and this could be your opinion, that's fine, on what you think was lacking about Meno's definition and how virtue.
Fun. So I have struggled a lot to define virtue for myself, so I cannot give you a good definition. But, you know, of course, you can poke holes at pretty much anyone's arguments where they're trying to define something. And so, first suggestion, the ability to rule over people is the virtue common to all. I think we can all see how that leads to you being a tyrant. You know, if virtue is just being able to rule over people, you might have a philosopher like Machiavelli, if you want to take that as an example. And so his second one, the virtue of a man is to manage his public affairs. It's very single-minded, you know? It's how you present yourself to others, your public affairs. It's not anything about, you know, any kind of internal morality or what you're striving to do with your life. And so his last suggestion, you know, you're not looking at why you're desiring these beautiful things, even what the beautiful things are. So if you're saying that the beautiful things are virtue, excellence of character, introspection, then sure, you know, I would say that's a good way to begin on the path of developing virtue. But if you're saying beautiful things as in material goods, that is far off from what I think virtue is. And then having the power to acquire them, it's just, you know, gaining power for your own benefit. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lorelai, I think there's still time for another question. So this is a causal question. If this study of ancient Greek philosophy is effective for forming excellent character, inspiring introspection, and lifelong learning, why is it that it's not being pursued?
So I've struggled with this myself because, you know, I haven't encountered a lot of it in education. And so I think to start with, people don't value just the pursuit of good things. You know, I think modern education, just generally, we're trying to teach students to memorize facts. You know, you have to get this information in your head for a test so we can make sure that you know these things, you know, and then it kind of reflects back on, well, why do we need these test scores? They go back to the government, we get our funding through that, obviously for public schools. But I don't think people find value in just questioning things. You know, there's a valid argument to be made for, you know, just having the ability to look at an argument and be able to question it yourself, you know, and to come up with maybe your own answer, compare it to others. And we don't do that enough in just typical life. I think that would be one of the reasons we don't find value for it, because those aren't the kinds of conversations we have with others. You know, it's a criticism in Democracy in America by Tocqueville, that Americans are so focused on working. That's what we're doing all the time. You know, there's nothing where we're scheduling time for us to just sit down, you know, relax and think and observe the world, you know, focus on community. We're just trying to improve our social standing or economic standing. And so, yeah, if you're saying that that's the meaning of life, just to, you know, get higher in these different levels, then you don't have a use for questioning. But for people with, I would say, maybe curious souls, you know, people who can't make it throughout their lives without questioning who they are and, you know, why they're here, questioning is necessary. And I don't think education is ready to acknowledge that yet.
Lorelai, your thesis is about adding philosophy into education across the board for all students. Historically, that wouldn't have been possible because education was for the rich. It's only been recently that education has been provided on a much wider scale. And even today, we still have large groups of people that do not have access to education because of their wealth. What I'm curious about is, if that's true, that education works better for the rich, or they have more leisure for education and to think about these things, someone could make the argument that for poor people, we should be educating them in skills and vocational ability so that they could gain wealth, and then maybe one day their children could study philosophy. That could be an argument that could be made. And I was just kind of curious, how would you respond to that argument?
In the beginning of writing my paper, that was something I struggled with. We have vocational schooling where people are just going in to memorize, stuff that they need to graduate, and then obviously to learn a particular skill or trade. And so for those kids, is it worthwhile to, study philosophy? And I would still say yes, because looking at the rest of their lives, their education right now is just preparing them for a job. It's just preparing them to graduate and immediately go into a career. And where's that going to get them? 10, 15 years down the line, are they still going to find meaning in life? Are they still going to have a curiosity about the world? Or are they just going to make their entire lives about their career? And so I would argue that yes, even, people who aren't as well off or just pursuing a trade, I would still say that those people should be at least provided with the opportunity to learn about philosophy, because it's a really easy way to find meaning in life, or at least be prepared with how you're going to question the meaning of life.
Thank you.
All right, great job, Lorelei. Let's give her another round of applause, please. And please welcome to the stage, Michaela Monticchio.
It is true that the American political climate is deeply divided. Hollywood and the entertainment industry, politics, social media, and news outlets all recognize the division within our country and rightfully demand for change. However, the cry for unity is often meaningless, as it is so often called for, and yet left to die in an echo chamber of wishful thinking. These are turbulent times, and it is rare that we see people of different political viewpoints able to live and work together without deep-rooted frustration and tension. Before true unity is possible, reconciliation must happen. Open-heartedness, love, respect, and a desire to come together are all needed when reconciling relationships. And when we look at America's political climate, it is easy to feel like we are so far gone. So how can reconciliation happen between political parties? This is not simply a Democrat or a Republican issue. The opportunity for elevated, eloquent, and empathetic political dialogue comes when we are willing to examine ourselves and therefore develop humility, civility, and respect. When seeking to understand why political dialogue is so divisive in this country, understanding the psychological aspects of how humans operate and use language is crucial. So here's a glimpse into the human thought process. There are two systems of thinking within the brain. The first is unconscious, emotional, and instinctual. This system of thought uses less thought and is therefore more prone to error. An example of this would be when you go into the fridge and you realize that your leftovers have been stolen, and you immediately assume it was your brother. You're making an assumption before you have all the facts. The second system of thought within the brain is logical, rational, and deals with conscious thought. An example of this would be working through math problems. So in the context of political dialogue, it's important to understand that bias lives in the first system of thought. Today, we will be talking about two forms of bias, the first being implicit bias. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious way, making them difficult to control. Everyone deals with implicit bias, and simply having these biases is not necessarily harmful. However, when an individual allows their bias to determine reality, that is where true problems arise. This can be as drastic as avoiding an African American man on the street out of an irrational fear, or as subtle as assuming an individual is racist simply because they come from a small rural town. When thinking about political reconciliation, it is easy to see how unchecked bias would make unity very difficult. This leads to the manifestation of confirmation bias. Once an individual has made their false judgment, now they will be looking for ways to confirm their beliefs. For example, who here has heard of the January 19th Lincoln Memorial confrontation? Show of hands. My class doesn't count. Anyone else? Okay, a few of you, but not many. Well, do you guys remember that YouTube video that took social media by storm about a year and a half ago, portraying an elderly Native American man playing a traditional drum, where a group of rowdy boys in Make America Great Again hats surrounded him? Does anybody remember this YouTube video? Okay, maybe a couple more of you. Were you as outraged as I was when you saw the blatant disrespect of the boys in the video? Well, what if I told you that the video you and I saw and the news reports that you and I watched did not give us an accurate representation of what really happened? After an extensive investigation, here's what I have found. It all started on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. A group of Covington High School students were walking to their buses. They had just left a March for Life rally they were attending earlier that day. Some of the boys wore MAGA gear, which is merchandise of former President Donald Trump. As the boys were boarding their buses, a group of Native Americans coming from an Indigenous Peoples March entered the scene. They noticed the boys noticed them, but initially the groups were separated and peaceful. Soon after, a group of Black Hebrew Israelites, which is an extremist group, came over hurling racial slurs and insults at not only the Native American men, as some of you may expect, but the Covington High School students. The situation soon escalates, of course, into that 1-minute video clip that you and I saw, and that captured the attention of the nation, portraying an elderly Native American man playing a traditional drum, and a boy in MAGA gear standing inches away smirking while his rowdy schoolmates encompassed them. Many were appalled by the blatant disrespect of the boys in the video. However, after an extensive investigation, it was proven that the boys did not initiate confrontation, and there was no evidence of the boys shouting any racial slurs, as was claimed by many media outlets throughout the country. Now, this is an extremely controversial video and story in general, and whether or not the boys are blameless or acted with full integrity can, of course, be disputed. However, that is not the point that's being made here. This story is simply being used to highlight the reality of confirmation bias at work on a grand scale within our country. Many media outlets made false assumptions, thus delivering false information to the American people. Liberals were outraged at the blatant disrespect of the boys in the video, while conservatives, of course, are immediately on the defensive, thus perpetuating negative stereotypes. Neither group is choosing to do further research for themselves. Unfortunately, the transmission of misinformation is not uncommon. The birth of social media was a revolutionary technological concept and is arguably one of the biggest digital influences in modern America. Now it is not only possible, but quite easy to speak with anyone from anywhere in the nation and beyond. 2.7 billion people are active on Facebook, a social networking platform. And TikTok, an immensely popular video sharing and social networking app, has over 1 billion users and has been downloaded in the US over 200 million times. Keep in mind, TikTok is only about 2 years old, so the popularity of this app is astonishing. It follows that many Americans receive much of their information and ideas from social media. The Pew Research Center made a statement saying, both mainstream politicians and extremist groups use Facebook and Twitter to spread their information. The inevitability of bias, coupled with the overwhelming amount of information available on social media, creates the perfect storm for strife among communities within this country. The Explore page on Instagram and the For You page on TikTok are feeds that are tailored to a person's preferences based on what they watch and double tap. By presenting more of what the individual wants to see, social media allows us to avoid information and opinions that do not align with our own. Rarely do we see people looking to further their knowledge and broaden their perspectives on social media. Oftentimes, the opposite is true. Leaving hate comments and dismissing a disagreeable post immediately after is much more gratifying than attempting to understand the content and the context behind each post. Okay, so I've just given you a lot to think over and consider. However, I would just like to encourage you that unity, despite political differences, is not such a far-fetched concept. After the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, many aspects of her life were brought to light as the nation mourned the loss of such a revered woman. Ginsburg was a Supreme Court justice, a job where clinging to one's emotional agenda is most important, right? Well, you would think so, but not necessarily. Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia, a fellow justice, were great friends despite vastly different political views. Ginsburg was a champion of progressive ideals, while Antonin Scalia was a conservative Republican. Rivals in the courtroom and yet great friends in all other aspects of life. The pair shared a deep love for opera and were actually in an opera together in New York. I know, crazy. They loved to travel, and their families actually spent New Year's Eve together up until Scalia's passing. So this is an example of moving beyond the politics to the person. Dismissing an individual solely on their political views is narrow-minded. And like Antonin Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the American people should be striving to build bridges across the ravine of party lines. Self-control and reflection must happen before whole communities are able to change how they communicate. And what does self-control look like in this context? Attempting to listen and understand differing opinions and views without feeling the need to voice or defend our own can only happen when a person is exhibiting control and is committed to growth. We must also accept the fact that we are not always right. And who here struggles with this? Because I know I do. It is easy to get defensive when we are corrected on something that we were so confident about. And our pride is wounded when we are forced to admit that we were wrong about parts of our political view. However, when taking part in political discussions with friends, whether that be on social media or in person, being conscious of our own bias and attempting to be a positive voice in the discussion rather than a destructive one, it will go a long way. Now, follow me here as this next point may be unexpected, and I truly believe we are all guilty of this in various ways. Avoid giving in to self-righteousness. And like I said, we're all guilty of this in various ways. Taking immense pride in how civil and humble we are is so easy to do. And yet, this is not what we should be doing. We should be coming from a place of love. Taking part in political dialogue is not an opportunity to look down on others while we flex our open-mindedness. The Bible states in 1 Corinthians 13, "If I speak in tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal." This verse shows us that our mindset should be one of love and respect, not of self-righteousness and pride. Now, you may be tracking with me and you agree and you're following, but you think, Michaela, there are those who are content to live life and avoid these uncomfortable changes. Many are not willing to reconcile with those they do not agree with or even respect. And this is certainly true. There are those who will choose comfort, complacency, and ignorance. However, Oftentimes, it is those very people who will get so frustrated with the hypocrisy and the hate and the division within American politics, and yet they're negatively feeding into these things themselves. One cannot complain or critique something one is not willing to change. Of course, this goes both ways. No political party is solely to blame. All are needed to reconcile. Through respectful and thoughtful language, being aware of our own biases, and intentionally diversifying our pool of perspectives will create the opportunity for eloquent and effective political discourse. America is a beautiful place, a place where so many different people, cultures, and religions converge in such a unique way. Here, there is potential for unity and diversity that will create the opportunity for a rich and meaningful life together. A place where everyone and every American, despite differing political views, can live and work together with respect, dignity, and peace. Thank you.
Great job, Michaela. We'll move into our Q&A session with Mr. Hornbaker.
Thank you, Michaela. One first question, an application question. In the beginning, you talked about implicit bias. Close to the end, you mentioned diversifying voices. Can you give us some other recommendations of how we can go about uncovering and beginning to see the implicit biases that we have?
Yeah, so I gave two rather drastic examples. You may remember the African American man avoiding people who we have irrational fears of, and then also simply assumptions. These are all parts of implicit bias. There's an action, and then there's also an assumption. And they can go hand in hand, but they can also be separate. So I think, and this really gets to the self-reflecting aspect of what I'm talking about, just being aware of people that we don't necessarily like for whatever reason. And then thinking, in what ways am I fearful of them? What assumptions am I making about them? Understanding that, and then a way to break those bonds that you may have around your mind and your heart is to go talk to those people. Go, learn from those people. And I think at Logos, we have a really unique opportunity to do that each and every day. It's such a diverse pool of not only people, but religions and perspectives. So each day I walk into this building, I am forced to take a step back and think, let me be open today and let me see who can teach me something. And oftentimes that comes from the most unexpected places.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michaela. If we think, this is based on just elaboration of what you already commented on, but the unwillingness of people to talk about politics. Is there a positive way to think of the unwillingness, since it's dependent on, it can be dependent on the respect and the civility of the conversation? Do you see those two coming together? How do you feel about those two together as, in a positive light?
Yeah, I think in America, we've created this culture, especially on social media, of it is okay to bash people. It is okay to use very disrespectful and harmful language towards people. And this is just something that I'm sure all of us in this room have just kind of accepted. So when it comes to political discussions and political dialogue, understanding that there is this culture, however, we need to divorce ourselves from this way of doing things, and then going about it in a more elevated, eloquent, and empathetic way will of course help. And as for people being tentative to talk about these issues because of, a respect thing, I think that again comes down to the self-reflection. There are things that I, of course, am not educated in, and so I'm going to listen from people who may have in this certain area, and then of course when I do know something, share it. So I think there is a way to talk about really deep, painful things in this country, as long as we're doing it in a real, loving, charitable way. Those things should and can be discussed.
Thank you.
Michaela, thank you for your presentation. The question I have for you is, I wholeheartedly agree with your thesis. I think our world and our culture needs a lot more of this empathetic discussion, understanding, listening. We could spend all day doing those things, but at some point, something still has to get done. Decisions need to be made. And one could argue if we have enough time, we can make better decisions. But the reality is life goes on, whether we have time to understand everybody, hear everybody's opinion or not. And sometimes we just have to make a decision. So if you were giving advice to someone who was in charge of a company or a school or had a diverse community, how would you recommend that they navigate both sides of this, of trying to understand everybody and yet still having to make decisions in a timely manner?
Yeah, so this actually reminds me of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States, as many of you know, and he was very active about diversifying his pool of perspectives. His cabinet was full of men from various different backgrounds and beliefs. And you may think that, this creates this tension, and there was, of course, some disconnect. However, this allowed Lincoln to make very wise and well-rounded and thoughtful decisions. So when we think about this today, I think you talk about things not getting done. I think one of the reasons why there's so much that needs to happen in politics is because we go back and forth arguing. A good first step is to change that arguing into constructive conversation, and then we can look at, okay, who are we electing into office? Are they helping? Are they getting things done? This is a deep discussion within politics. But I would say turning that arguing and that divisive nature, turning that into something positive and constructive will inevitably move us as a nation forward more.
Thank you.
Michaela, a question for you as it relates to how change happens and the most effective way to make change. As you think of political conversation taking place across our country, there's a lot of settings in which that conversation happens. National news, local neighbors, a lot of examples in between. In your opinion, based on all the work that you've done, where is the most sustainable and effective change happening? Does it come from the top, our highest level of elected officials, or does it come from the bottom, the people that are not officially involved in politics, but are just members of a local community? And I'll specifically reference, many of the debates we saw last fall that were filled with exactly the type of language that you're warning us against.
Right.
So where does this change come from? Is it from the top? Is it from the bottom? Or is it something else?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it can go both ways, but it's more heavily weighted towards local change. Actually, during World War II, a group of farmers and city officials out in the Midwest got discussion groups together, and rural farmers and inhabitants began discussing with urban leaders and citizens. And during World War II, we had just come out of the Depression, the Dust Bowl. there was this real disconnect in the Midwest between urban and rural communities. So what local officials did there is, let's get together in a room, face to face, and let's talk about it. Everybody has their emotional reasons why things are not happening the way they think they should. So if we can get into a room and start discussing these things, again, in a respectful and loving manner, change does begin to happen. So it really is on a local level. Local politics oftentimes is a lot less crazy than national politics. But I don't want to totally discredit the federal government and the influence that they have, because with social media, again, things spread, and I think everyone, whether that be on a local level or on a national level, should be adopting these qualities.
Okay, and my question has more to do with the unchecked bias that you mentioned. How can are there practical steps to checking someone's bias? Have you come across that in your research of how that could be done?
Yeah, so one of the telltale signs of when bias is really has a hold of somebody's heart and mind is just the amount of emotional appeal that's happening. I want to be very careful, because there are things that are very emotional and should be very emotional to people. So in terms of like pointing fingers like, oh, they're biased, that's not what we're getting at. But I think in terms of like reflecting within ourselves, we can be aware of, I have this belief, I have this opinion, let me check, let me do my research, talk with people who don't have the same political view as me. Ugh, I know it's hard, but it's necessary. And inevitably our bias, we start to broaden our perspective, and we say, oh, this isn't a horrible human being. This is a person like me who has their own emotional argument, and that's not bad. We just need to start talking about it as a nation, rather than getting mad at each other on social media.
Michaela, I personally have struggled with the role of social media in my life. And so my question for you is going to be very practical, very advice-oriented, all right? So I struggle with social media in lots of ways, one of which is just the time-consuming nature of it. Another one is also just listening to a lot of people's opinions and letting that kind of taint how I feel about different things. And so I decided that I would get rid of social media in my life. Now the problem is I feel very disconnected with what's going on, because so much of social media is how we get our news and even local events or things like that, not just politics. So where is the happy medium? What would you recommend to someone like me who doesn't want to be negatively influenced and yet still wants to be informed?
That's a good question. In my research, I found that adults spend around an average of 4 hours on their phone a day, and teenagers spend around 7.5 hours. And again, that's an average. We can check our phones and see how much time we're spending on our phones. It's scary, I know. So when it comes to social media, people are spending this extensive amount of time on their phones, and a lot of it goes to social media. This is something that I struggle with as well, because I will go through comment sections and I'll just get so frustrated, bummed out, like, are you kidding me? So there definitely is something to be said for deleting social media. Personally, however, I find that very hard to do. I've done it for like periods in my life, but never for an extended amount of time. Again, self-control, knowing when to put your phone down and go do things. Take from Lorelai's presentation, self-reflect, go sit outside. These are all things that are necessary as humans. Devices have only been around, for the past century, if that, and phones a lot less than that. So we as humans are not meant to be on our devices as much as we are. So just knowing when to put it down and maybe you need someone to help you, keep you accountable. Like a gym buddy, you can have a social media buddy who's going to be like, okay, we're not going to do it right now. And that's helpful too. Don't underestimate the power of self-accountability and friend or family accountability.
Thank you.
Yep.
Mr. Hortman, I'll be your social media buddy. Let's give Ms. Montecchio another round of applause, please. All right, please welcome to the stage Yamil Pena.
I believe offensive speech should stay legally protected. Would you want to have your ability to express your ideas limited just because another person does not deem it appropriate, even if you feel like it is your duty to share it? You're right, that's not okay. This, among other reasons I'll speak about, is why you should allow others to express their morals and ideals freely, even if you disagree with them. There are a multitude of reasons why I believe someone should support a person's right to express their ideas freely, but today I'll talk about three. The first one being, there can't be double standards for what speech is legal or socially acceptable. This is because, one, there will always be contradictions between people's truths, biases, and personal beliefs. So if you think about the way you grew up, your life experiences, your environment, even your culture, you've been taught from many different sources what might or might not be okay. And of course, there's just the fact that everybody thinks differently and has a different perspective on things. So people will always disagree on some things, trivial things and important things. Secondly, as to why double standards for speech should not be okay, is not okay, is that people hold their own beliefs that may or may not differ to another's. So who's to say that what you believe is undeniably the truth as opposed to what somebody else might believe? A good example of this is the idea of religion. Of course, there are many Christians here that wholeheartedly believe in the Bible and Jesus' teachings, but if you question someone who has faith in another religion, they will wholeheartedly believe in what that religion teaches. So of course, to each of those people, even though they believe in different things, to them, those things are an undeniable truth. So who's to say that what you believe is undeniably the truth? Thirdly, it's unethical to allow one set of beliefs to prosper while shaming and censoring another. Think about a time where you might have had an unpopular opinion in the group, discussion or conversation. And let's say somebody shunned you and tried maybe mocking you. Even though you believe what you were saying was worth sharing and was worth other people hearing, of course, that would feel wrong. The second reason why offensive speech should stay legally protected is that the conveying of ideas to one another is the foundation of creation and the upbringing to modern society. Just look around you. Humanity has progressed to the point it's at because of the sharing of ideas, the sharing of the good and the bad that our minds have had to offer over the many centuries. Think of good inventions like engines, modern architecture, and phones. Of course, there are also those bad ideas, but the reason why bad ideas are also worth hearing is because you can take those bad ideas, revise them, and use them to contribute to better things. Like, let's say an engineer is working on making a performance engine for a car, but they end up making a bad decision that makes that engine fall apart or whatever. Of course, they can take those bad ideas, revise them to contribute to a better good. The second reason why the conveying of ideas to one another is the foundation of creation and the upbringing to modern society is that allowing people to converse and discuss their beliefs freely will allow the society to genuinely deny the bad and accept the good and move forward with that to better their society. For example, Martin Luther King Jr., who in his time, the ideas he had to share may have been controversial to a lot of people. Of course, today we accept those without a second thought for good reason. But back then, many people would not want the ideas he had to share to become one with the society they lived in. So you may be wondering, what's something that specifically ties into your own personal life? What's something that directly affects you? Well, if nothing else, refraining from controlling and censoring speech and trying to remain open-minded genuinely builds character, which results in a better society. Exposing yourself to beliefs that oppose your own allows you to think critically and expand on your own thoughts and perspective. Something that would be the opposite of this would be a thing many people do called confirmation bias, which is where they seek out information either consciously or unconsciously that reassures and reaffirms their own current beliefs. And of course, you wouldn't want to do that because if you're just seeking to further your own agenda in a discussion, you're not really going to contribute anything of value to other people or even yourself. Another way that refraining from controlling and censoring speech builds character is that approaching discussion with extreme bias and closed-mindedness is unproductive for society. There's a quote by a man named David Axelrod, who was a senior advisor to a former president. During an interview, he stated, "These virtual reality silos. I mean, we can curate our news sources in such a way that our views are always affirmed and not always informed. And everyone inside the silo is kosher, and everyone outside is alien. And you know, that's a real danger." Just think of Twitter, for example, and social media in general, actually. How all of these social media platforms just seek to give you information, whether it's news or entertainment, that reaffirms your own beliefs instead of allowing you and giving you the tools to question them and build off of them for the betterment of your own character and other people and society, ultimately. So if there's one thing that you should remember from each of these 3 points I talked about as to why offensive speech should stay legally protected, it's that there can't be double standards for what speech is legal or socially acceptable. This is because people hold to their own beliefs that may or may not differ to others. So who's to say what you believe is undeniably the truth? Next, the conveying of ideas to one another is the foundation of creation and the upbringing to our modern society, which is also because allowing people to converse and discuss their ideas freely will allow the society to genuinely deny the bad and accept the good. And lastly, if nothing else, refraining from controlling and censoring speech and trying to remain open-minded genuinely builds character, which results in a better society. And of course, this is because exposing yourself to beliefs that oppose your own allows you to think critically and expand on your own thoughts and perspective. A lot of counter-arguments I've heard as to why offensive speech or even just speech that the person may disagree with should be illegal. One of them would be, why should people be allowed to make distasteful or even racist comments? And to that, my response has always been that everyone has different viewpoints, moral values, and ideas of what is right and wrong. We can't decide through majority rules as society what should or should not be allowed. Because after all, from that person's perspective, we could be wrong in our ideas. Another thing I hear a lot about why being against like freedom of expression and freedom of speech is that shouldn't it be okay to silence those who say hateful things because of how those negative ideas may impact society? But no, because even then, simply silencing them does not correct what you believe to be wrong about the ideas they're sharing. Rather, using your own right to freedom of expression and your own right to freedom of speech, argue as to why they're wrong to set an example to society, and so everyone can know why those hateful ideas are wrong. That's how you lead to a better society. Allowing the restriction of speech, even in small cases, can easily pave the path to restricting even more speech, such as simple opinions and ideas, or even thoughts. An extreme example of this being an Orwellian dystopia, such as the one portrayed in the novel 1984. This is because by allowing those with ideas who oppose each other to censor their opposition, it gives a sense of false justification for that action. So, considering everything I've said today, I'll ask you again. Would you go on to limit the expression of ideas that oppose your own, or advocate for the censoring of offensive or inflammatory speech? Would you, an embodiment of free will and thought, not find another's expression of their free thought being censored as unacceptable and unjust? Thank you.
Thank you, Emil. We'll begin our Q&A session, starting with Mr. Hornbaker.
Yamil, thank you very much. I'm going to begin with a question just to ask you to make a little bit of a distinction, maybe clarify terms. Your thesis is offensive speech should stay legal. I'm wondering if you can clarify what is the difference between something that is offensive and what is simply a different viewpoint. You specifically mentioned MLK as a person whose ideas would widely be accepted today, though at his time were not widely accepted, as I understood your example, which I think most people would agree. There were people that opposed his ideas and people that agreed with his ideas. I don't know that you would find agreement that many people considered his speech offensive. I think his actual model that he referred to many times was peaceful delivery of the message. So I'm just asking you to clarify, what's the distinction here between simply differing views and offensiveness?
Well, of course, I think offensive speech is subjective. So, and what I think offensive speech is that person who, let's say, just heard something, sure, they can disagree with it, but if it's offensive to them, that would invoke a emotional reaction, even if it's just a little bit. A reaction that they feel personally attacks them. That's what I think offensive speech is.
Thank you, Yamil. My question is more of just elaboration more of, if we think of our society consists of children, we have children in our society, and they're looking up to adults, they're looking around. How would you incorporate that idea of this, that how would you incorporate your statement with how one would bring up a child, or what a child would see and hear in a society? Because the society does play a role in raising a child.
So what exactly are you asking?
Okay, so the question is, how, if there was a freedom in what you could say, and everybody could say what they needed to, everybody had a view, and, something to share. And if it was indeed offensive, how would there be guidelines for a child or when children are around?
Well, of course, there are environments where offensive speech may not be allowed. So let's say a private institution like Logos Academy, you're not allowed to say certain things. And of course, I agree with that. There's a time and place for everything. People shouldn't not just because it's wrong, but because it should go against what their morals should be, that they shouldn't say it. So of course, there are places where I do believe that people shouldn't be allowed to say things, but I don't think somebody should be seen as a criminal for it.
Thank you.
All right, Yumil, thank you for your presentation. I felt you got a lot of good statements that supported your argument, and I'm just curious. In the beginning of your speech, you had a section on religion, and you made a statement that I would agree with, that when we're talking to somebody else about our religion, that we would be thoughtful that they don't necessarily believe that our beliefs are true, and we would leave room for that. But you also made statements that state that the society can go from one thing to a better place through dialogue and discussion. So how are you judging what truth is or what better is, at the same time guarding everybody's right to have their own opinion? Do you understand what I'm asking? Yeah.
Okay. So that's something that I've always struggled to answer for myself, about what is objectively the truth or objectively better. So I don't think I can answer that, but what I can say is that if it can be seen as if it's something that's seen as virtuous or can be widely agreed upon as good, then I think that's what people should be aiming for. But of course, if I'm going on the idea of that, if it's widely accepted, I'm assuming you might be wondering, then why can't offensive speech be made illegal? Because let's say a lot of people disagree with it. And to that, I'd say, I don't think there's an overwhelming majority of people who go against freedom of speech or things like the First Amendment. So yeah, I think there are plenty of people who are for it. It's not something that's widely agreed upon as bad.
Thank you.
Yumil, I want to elaborate on a few things you've mentioned so far. In response to Ms. Clark, I heard you say there are places to limit speech where it would be appropriate, maybe a private institution like you mentioned. I want to ask you about actions beyond speech. So speech is an action. Let's think of, driving a car. There are a lot of laws in place that regulate how one drives a car. Where you can drive it, the speed you can drive it, who is eligible legally to drive the car or any vehicle. I'm wondering if you can talk to us about what is the place of law as it pertains to speech, and can it be separate from other types of actions or things that are done?
So are you asking, what are you asking?
So you've talked a little bit about consensus or the majority opinion. Is there a place for the law to say, not just various institutions, is there a place for the law to say what speech is permitted in certain areas? Like, I'll give you an example, one that's commonly referenced. Certain things can't be said on an airplane. Is it the place of government to institute a law, or does every airline company simply need to say, that's our rule, you can't say this on our airplane? Is there a place for, in this case, federal law to restrict speech?
Yeah. Uh, well, no, not if you're asking if the government is allowed to restrict speech, but if, let's say, an owner of a private institution like the school or those airline companies, which they own those planes, they're the ones providing the services. They do have their own right, which is also their First Amendment right, to restrict the speech of others, which may or may not be agreeable. But in most cases, I think it is.
And how would you suggest it's handled in places that maybe are considered public, like a park, for example?
A park? I think as long as an example of this I've heard a lot is should someone be allowed to say, like, shout fire in a crowded theater or like bomb in an airport? No, because that's causing commotion. That's not sharing an idea. That's seeking action to be taken. That's causing commotion. So that's where it would be. That's where the line is.
And what if the person who said that maintained their defense as just saying, well, you're just interpreting what I said in a certain context?
Well, I think there's a certain level of practicality to these things, and to something like that, somebody defending themselves for shouting bomb in an airport, it'd be as simple as they're just wrong. Because they're invoking a reaction to people, and they're not seeking thought and critical thinking, they're invoking a reaction.
But I understand you to be saying that offensive speech should be permitted, so I think that would include speech that's intended to invoke a certain type of response from people as well.
Well, I still think that speech should be protected because unless their goal is to obviously cause unrest in the area, that would be their job. A peace officer's job would be, of course, to keep the peace. So let's say in a protest, someone was trying to start a fight by saying things. That's where the line is. That's where you're breaking the law, because you're trying to invoke a reaction. You're trying to cause commotion instead of just sharing an idea.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder if the next question might be, which is harder to assess, intent or speech itself? This is a very challenging topic, Emil, and I think I personally appreciate how you're maintaining that encountering different opinions can strengthen us collectively and sharpen our viewpoints and understanding. I'm just inviting you to think about where are potentially some of these limits for what might be called free speech or offensive speech. So thank you.
We have time for you. Yamil, I have a more practical kind of question. So again, I'm looking for some advice in this sense, or what you would suggest for us to do these days. We've all heard about cancel culture. It seems to be a response, and cancel culture is not new to humanity. It's just new to social media, I think. But this idea that we could just silence people, and you stated very clearly that silencing people does not correct them, and so therefore it doesn't meet the goal that we should be aiming for. So when we do meet somebody that is saying offensive things, whether intentionally or not, what is the correct response, or how do you suggest that we handle those situations?
So are you asking how someone should respond to another person who is saying either unethical things or something
That's
I
right.
disagree with? Okay. I would, if it was me in that situation, I would just go up to them and either challenge their viewpoint, and if it's possible, have a debate. Not like a robotic debate, but just talk about it.
Okay, thank you. And as they continue with the offensive speech, then what do you suggest?
Well, if it's obvious they're not open to their minds being changed and are just there to further their agenda like I talked about, then I would just ignore them.
Okay, thank you.
Let's keep it going for Yamil, Michaela, and Lorelei. Thanks again for attending and for tuning in. Tune in and attend again tomorrow, same time, same place, as we'll be getting a little more science-y tomorrow. We'll be hearing from Shanika Holcomb, Genevieve Ruff, and Mary Burnaby Cruz. All right, so this concludes day one. Students, you may return to your home.